Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Zain Abusair, and on behalf of my colleagues in the Wallenberg studio, Charlie O'Gene, Don Gilpin, Jeffrey Toon, Gina Reichert, Neil Robinson, Nitzan Farfel, and Tess Clancy, it is a pleasure to welcome you and to introduce this year's Wallenberg guest lecturer, Mark Smout. This lecture is made possible through the generous support of the Binda Lecture Fund. The fund reflects a quiet but enduring proposition that architecture advances not only through production, but through exposure, ideas, arguments, and practices that widen the discipline's frame. That proposition finds its pedagogical counterpart in the Wallenberg studio. As the final undergraduate studio at Taubman College, the studio is shaped by the legacy of Raoul Wallenberg, a Taubman alumni whose actions during World War II exemplified ethical resolve under conditions of profound risk. The studio takes that legacy seriously, asking how architecture might register responsibility, act with care, and exercise agency in a world defined by uneven power and consequences. This year, the studio is organized around the theme land, where it is understood as a charged field, claimed and bordered, extracted and regulated, cultivated and repaired. For the Wallenberg studio, land becomes both medium and metric, a way to test what architectural tools can do when the land itself is political, ecological, and unstable. It is within this expanded understanding of land that the work of Smout Allen becomes especially instructive. Smout Allen is co-founded by Professors Mark Smout and Laura Allen and based at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, where they both teach architectural design and co-direct its landscape architecture master's program. Their design research explores architecture's relationship with environmental and territorial change and insists that land is active and that architecture must develop new representational and operative capacities to engage it. Exhibited internationally, including at 4 Venice Architecture Biennales, their work combines conceptual design with innovative representation and passive systems. They have won the Architecture Award from the Royal Academy, the Drawing of the Year Prize, and have been presented with the honorary fellowships from the Royal Institute of British Architects in recognition for their contribution to teaching and the profession. Their teaching supports diverse and speculative agendas that bridge architecture with the humanities, sciences, and the arts. Their students from Unit 11 regularly receive major awards, and their collaborations span institutions such as MIT, the University of Southern California Library, and the British Council, to name a few. At a moment where architecture is asked to operate within increasing conditions of instability, actively changing landscapes, and expanded forms of practice, Mark Smout's work and teaching offers a precise and compelling alignment. It models a practice where land becomes a site of inquiry, where responsibility, tangible recordings, ephemeral states, and fictional events are open to the spontaneous and the serendipitous. Please join me in welcoming Mark Smout.
Thank you. Thank you. Very generous introduction, and you've covered everything in the lecture, really. Anyway, I'd also like to thank you, Zain, for getting me here, and also like to thank Riley for putting up with my emails for so long as well, which is very good. So I'm a professor of architecture at UCL and I'm teaching there for sort of 28, 30 years, something like that. Laura, obviously, isn't here at the moment. She also teaches there as well and has run various programs there. She ran undergraduate for a very long time and has done lots of other stuff. We are fairly embedded in the place, I think. However, in our time there, we've been very lucky with the people that have been around us. Our context has been fantastic. We were very lucky to be there when Peter Cook was there, and the absolute blinding chaos that he brought to the place and the energy, which was fantastic. It was just, I've got so many stories that I can't really go into here, but they're all very good. I can assure you that. So that was how we grew up. We grew up where kind of anything within teaching was possible, and you could teach anything at the same time. But also be very mindful about the stuff that you're producing and have the correct sort of energy and the correct sort of focus in the work as well, which with Peter was always on design. Anyway, enough of the reminiscing. Let's get to business. So I'm going to show two projects, really. I realised I've been talking for about 5 hours today. It's been very nice to meet you all. So literally meet all of you. So I showed some quite rough stuff in the Shakespearean area. I don't know what you call it, the theatre in the round thing in the round in there. And I showed some sketchbooks and everything. This is a slightly more polished lecture with some of the research and context which are interlaced into it. So it'll be slightly different, I guess. And there are two very distinct projects which I didn't show earlier. So just in case you were thinking of leaving early, you won't have seen this stuff. Okay, so lots of people ask us why we call these sort of pairs of projects super mega raw realistic. I guess it's from it's a compound word from Mary Poppins, supercalifragilistic, but we decided to put our own bent on it, and it describes something that is sort of above and very large and rural and characterized by those attributes. So it seemed quite a straightforward title, to be honest. So I now consider the matter closed. So that's the word, but what about the background? So I'm just going to discuss a couple of things here that sort of led us to where we are. You could discuss this sort of interesting and rather appropriate avant-garde scheme from times when design was possibly a little bit freer, and avant-garde design work was less likely to be, burned up with the sort of the context that we exist in today. This is Archizoom's Non-Stop City, and the residential parking's the climatic, what's it called? The climatic universal system. As you can see, it offers a ubiquitously urban condition, a seemingly endless architectural structure occupying all available space. Repetitions of identical columns, cores, slabs are reminiscent of supermarkets, parking lots, factories, and industrial sheds. Consumer products and commodities freely available for the inhabitants' use as tools for modifying territories and lifestyles. Uniformly technologically serviced and climate-controlled, energy, air and light are distributed via technical chambers from below ground. Transport networks occupy the exterior along with random instances of nature. The rest of the architecture is continuous, non-hierarchical and repeatable. And that's an aspect that sort of really interests us in relation to our landscape projects. The man-made grid is superimposed on its host landscape. However, in the interior, the placing of samples, rocks, hills, and rivers, Archizoom suggested the overlap of architecture and nature, or synthetic nature, in the same place. In contrast to the more typical condition, the replacement of one by the other, architecture as an antithesis to nature. City versus countryside and the autonomy of architecture is a typical trope of that era. Archizoom's collective dwelling excluded the rural and unproductive world and replaced it with a curated landscape, favouring, I assume, the controllability of a synthetic system to the unpredictable and uncontrollability of nature. So 30 years later, Brandsey did Agronica, which was in the mid-90s, I think, where he sort of hybridised the city and the countryside, the rural and the industrial. So the scheme challenged the dichotomy of city versus countryside once more, and instead imagines a continuous and inhabited distributed infrastructure, hybrid landscapes this time of garden and agriculture. Nature is cultivated as a garden, with its walls as woodland, and agricultural land is increased to demineralise urban space, transforming it into a continuous vertical and horizontal zone of vegetation. So Super Mega Ruralistic is a response to a research project, an exhibition titled Regional Globalism in the Tennessee Valley, and did that with a number of people. There was Kathy and Jeff. Hi, Kathy. where are you? There you are. Yeah. Post and the Open Workshop and a few other people. So it explored how the Tennessee Valley became a testing ground for modernization shaped by New Deal era policies and large-scale infrastructure projects managed by organizations like the TVA, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The region has been a site of energy development, environmental management, and technological process. So it's established in the TVA was established in 1933 as part of Roosevelt's New Deal and was aimed to kind of modernize the Tennessee Valley. And it was a region that was particularly devastated by the Great Depression. I mean, you probably know all this better than I do, but it was conceived as a large-scale regional planning experiment, and it was very much an experiment at the time. It focused on flood control, electricity generation, agricultural improvement, economic development, building of roads, etc. And it spanned a huge amount of the Tennessee river system. I don't have quite the square miles or whatever. So it provided hydroelectric plants to provide power to rural areas and flood-prone communities. So I think the TVA is one of the largest US public utility companies currently. So it's a company that is trying to integrate renewable energy and sustainable land management at the same time. So the question for us was, is Tennessee ready for any change? The climate is changing quite rapidly. Extreme rainfall events have become more intense and less predictable across the southeast US. Summertime precipitation may decrease by the end of the century, but with no corresponding increases in precipitation during the other seasons to kind of compensate that. Some types of extreme weather events, such as extreme heat, heat waves, drought, and heavy rainfall are likely to increase. Floods would be more frequent and droughts would be longer, which would increase the difficulty of meeting the competing demands for water in the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. So periodic droughts would affect things like groundwater levels and stream flows and things like that. And the flood mitigation ability of the TVA dam system, i.e. the sort of releasing and controlling of water through those dams, would be effective on a day-to-day basis, but it is unlikely to be able to cope with that kind of increased frequency in the future. But what does this mean, and what's the impact of that, and what can be done? The increased unpredictability of water supply levels in the Tennessee Valley will have a huge impact on agriculture and food availability. Some small farmsteads in the region have begun to test alternative, more resilient models. An example of this is the small-scale experimental farming in Tennessee in the form of the Obed Forest Garden, which uses no herbicides, no pesticides, anything like that, or chemical fertilizers, and is instead just working with organic matter. This is followed by dense seeding and mass planting of bare root plants, and there's a system called deep mulch occultation and dense mass planting, which seem to me to be sort of good names for a death metal band. And the Earth Advocates Research Farm, which are the people there you can see, who focus on ethnobotanical research. I never quite kind of understood what it was, but it sounded interesting. And a nursery for drought-tolerant plants for evolving mid-Tennessee climate. And I remember the name of the two people who ran this, and that was down there, Adam and Sue Turtle, which are great names, aren't they? And then finally, the top right, we have the New Forest Farm, which is a diverse restoration agricultural research site in southwestern Wisconsin. It's a way away from where we were, but it was interesting nonetheless in the scalability of how they operated the farm there. So 10% of the valley's energy currently comes from hydro generation, but the TVA is planning a rollout of more renewable energy projects in the coming years with a focus on solar and wind power. They're also simultaneously rolling out new fossil fuel plants, which is strange and contradictory. But anyway, some of those fossil plants are being decommissioned, but they're replacing the ones that are being decommissioned on those sites. I guess one of the things that struck us about the TVA was it's very well positioned actually to step away from fossil fuels and move into other large-scale renewable programs. There were things like, things that interested us were floating solar farms that could be deployed around TVA's immense reservoirs, the huge network of reservoirs there when you look at them on a plan, because it's effectively free land to put those solar cells on. And studies have shown that that floating solar farms are much more efficient because they disperse the heat underneath them and they can generate X% more electricity. I'm not quite sure what it was. It was something like 10%. So if you will have joined me earlier today in the funny round space next door, you'll have seen kind of a way that Laura and I work, and we do a sort of quick ideas and quick sketches. So this was kind of quick idea number one. This is the Raccoon Mountain pumped hydro storage scheme on the Tennessee River. So water is pumped from the Tennessee River up to the top of Raccoon Mountain, and then in times of high demand for the hydro for electricity, it's allowed back through some generators. So it works like a large storage battery. What we were thinking is that we could use that as the surface for a floating photovoltaic energy farm, and then build a community around the outside of it. So these are just very quick sketches of the ideas. These start in sketchbooks, which some of you may have seen earlier, and from funny little sketches like that on the right, and then we try and sort of try and make them scalable in some form, and then develop them into these plans. And so the idea was we were trying to build communities around these particular events, and there's sort of what's called the riparian territory, which is the edge between the water and the land. You can also see on there that there's the idea of trails and public amenity that could connect the areas with its sort of recreational goals that it has. But one thing we weren't sure about is what exactly is a farm in this context. The TVA, of course, brought lots of agricultural modernisation to rural economies in Tennessee by establishing what were called model farms that served as centres of knowledge and experimentation, promoting methods that balanced efficiency with long-term sustainability. Their agricultural programs became a model for today's agricultural extension services, as new fertilizers and test demonstration methods were adopted throughout the nation. So Tennessee is now home to lots of agri-research and agricultural education centers, which you probably know, and they focus on future-proofing the agricultural landscape of the state. But as exciting as this is, farmers are actually just getting very much older, and farm life is no longer attractive, and it doesn't seem to be a viable career for many. The average age of a farmer in Tennessee is 57 and a half, and 1 in 3 is considered sort of 1 in 3 of the farmers is beyond European retirement age as well. So it's a business that is unsustainable at the moment. And one of the most interesting facts about it is that more than half of the farmers in Tennessee have a primary occupation other than farming, so they farm part-time. So obviously there's a poverty and a race and economic and social politics playing a huge part in all of this, and the statistics are much more complex than I can tell you about here, but the reality is that farming life is dwindling. We hoped that our riverine model, as we called it, as a farm, would be one that attracts a younger farmer, and farmers with young families from a broader range of backgrounds, and trying to think of ways that help farmers stay the distance. So, as I said before, there was Tennessee. The TVA has a huge history of modernising farms, and ones that sort of balance the efficiency of the farm against the demands of the public, and those, as you can see here, these are from a very long time ago, but you can see that those programs became the models that most countries now follow. But now we have a sort of a plethora of technologies to aid ever-intensified farming. Autonomous agricultural machinery, or we called it, in our project, we called it Helping Hands, which would operate a sort of a precision farming policy on your farm, and would look at data analytics and automation to help optimize things. And the super mega ruralistic model farm used the idea of a semi-autonomous system, so that you could have an autonomous system that was a backup for you. So farming would not be 24/7, 365 days a year. If you wanted to go out or something, there'd be a system that could take up the slack. So in a way, you were a farmer 100% of the time, but you didn't have to be present for the 100% of that time. So we took lots of field trips when we were there as well, which were very interesting. And I went to the University of Tennessee's Agri-Research Center, So these set up a natural development from their field stations they used to have. It was very extensive visit, looking at lots of turf grass management, as you can see here, soybean, corn, and wheat breeding, and all of that. And the images are sort of test panels for sports turf testing, and also for the paint that you'd use on sports turf as well, which I found quite fascinating, and ended up photographing lots and lots of that around the place. It's very funny to see big football pitches just with different spots of colour on them. Of particular interest in this place, though, were in the greenhouses. They have these greenhouses on the campus in some shadowy shipping containers there that, you know, they don't let you go in, obviously, but they have things like Fresh Electric Farm written on the side of them. So we then really started thinking about light consumption in plants, because that seemed to be the area where most of the research was in this research centre. So, you know, they would grow plants in monitorable plants in enclosed spaces, and looking at localized food production in relation to that. They're also looking at high-value crops grown in greenhouses under different wavelengths of light. So these are examining how variable conditions can affect plant growth and can manipulate some of the volatile compounds. Essentially, they can control aroma and taste by putting different wavelengths of light into the plant, which to us was fascinating. But what if the light farms were outside the greenhouse? So this is an interesting, albeit less scientific, piece of art, actually, by a Dutch artist called Dutch artist Studio Roosegaard. And it's a field-based work that you can only kind of be really appreciated close up. And this is a very long exposure photograph. It doesn't actually look like that. But the lights stimulate the growth, and they sort of nod towards controlling pests as well by keeping them away. Because they have to be careful not to have any light pollution in this area. But it's a really beautiful project. And then we saw lots of more coloured greenhouses. These are a bit sort of, I don't know, I became fascinated in all these photographs. I got thousands of them. And they're sort of, I always thought they were like J.G. Ballard meets Ian Banks in the culture novels. I don't know if you know those. There's these two colliding sort of worlds that exist in these places. And we can see how LED lights may supplement some of the replacement light for winter production of tomatoes, for example, in this case. So, in the world of super rural megalithic, we're proposing fluctuating light fields where this research and commercial work can take place. However, we're proposing that the electricity consumption is directly linked to the buffer on renewable energy generation going into the grid, i.e. if you're generating a lot of electricity, you can pump a lot of that spare electricity, which they normally burn off in cooling towers or in transformers. You can pump it into various fields and change the colour of the fields, essentially providing a very localised light signature that reflects local energy production and consumption, a link between the climate and the human occupation of those valleys. So in place of some rather fancy renderings, we think these photos show the qualitative side of things rather well. This is a German photographer called Tom Hagen. He's got lots of lovely photographs online, which you can find. This is the Greenhouse series, and it provides an overview of our Earth's surface that's been transformed by the kind of human presence. But we imagine this is what our landscape would hopefully look like. So we came up with a term. So the French talk at length about the terroir of wine, the characteristics given to a wine by a particular climate and the particular ground where a grape was grown. What we were suggesting is that there was a sort of what we called a luxoir, and we were suggesting that there's a unique and local quality of local light that would create special flavours and special volatile compounds in high-value crops, say herbs like mountain mint and things like that. These are crops that the farmers would be able to sell for a lot more than the ones they sell currently. They're sort of little, I think Jeff Mano, a friend of ours, referred to them as little tasty morsels of full-spectrum Tennessee, but he's a writer, so he would say things like that, I think. But anyway, so this is the final site for the proposal, which is in a town called Johnsonville, which is East Tennessee, which is permanently flooded by the creation of the Kentucky Dam and lake created by the TVA in 1944. So the damming was aimed at preventing devastating floods that had happened before, and lots of other states. It hasn't really done that, but it also assisted commercial navigation and things like that, and power generation. The site, more specifically, and this is from flood insurance rate maps, or FIRM, which you get very accurate drawings of flood areas, is on the side of Duck River, which is just by Johnsonville, and it's at the confluence with the Tennessee River. So on our site plan here, the grey hatch indicates a special flood hazard area subject to inundation by the 1% annual chance. And that's kind of where we're basing a lot of our project. So these are some early sketches to examine the topography on the shallow elevations of the floodplain and the riparian banks of the river. We're starting to put sort of things in place, starting to try and understand the scale of our investigations. And those of you I spoke to before will recognise these as some sketches that appeared in sketchbooks and then have appeared as sort of slightly more formalised drawings. So inserted into this is a model farm community of agricultural and domestic buildings, courtyards and paddocks. So more of our working method is creeping in here. There's the sketch at the bottom there. And what I didn't mention before is that sometimes there's a little bit of anthropomorphism creeps into these things as well. So you think of a name or a title for a thing you might be drawing. I don't know. I can't remember what Laura called this one. It was either the weak hat or the witch's hat. I don't know. But it's a way of trying to become friendly or familiar with your drawing, which is quite handy. The strongest reference for us, though, in the way we designed some of the buildings was that of the cantilever barn, which is a very distinct feature of East Tennessee's agricultural landscape. It's a mishmash of ideas, I think, from imported vernaculars from Northern Europeans and changing farm practices when people got onto those sites. Their second-story lofts extend beyond the ground level cribs, and they create a rather large understory underneath where animals can live and the heat goes up. And the spacious open lofts provide a lot of ventilation. They look incredibly precarious, though. I wouldn't have invented those, I don't think, if I did that. Anyway, so we took lots and lots of photos of these barns, went around Tennessee, photographed them all, and we lifted ideas from them and tried to collage them together like this by drawing over them. So this is just one example of one of the drawings we did. We're trying to establish a design language. We're thinking about the raised crib for a shelter. We were sort of mixing the domestic and the agricultural forms into this sort of hybrid typology and looking at different possibilities for living and working within those typologies. We rotated the roof pitch to the crib, elongated some of them to make longer structures, looking at merging the roof profile and the groundscape, and lots of other things as well, which are kind of self-explanatory, I think. So here's another sketch of showing the development of the designs for the buildings. What we're trying to do here with a barn, with the lexicon we developed for those barns, is sort of looking at domestic, recreational, infrastructural architecture that's directly integrated with its environment, that respects its fluid landscape, the rivers, the reservoirs, etc. The other way we thought of these model farms is that they were a totally new generation of experimentation stations as well. So they would be growing high-value crops, but they'd also be places for experimentation. So they would model in themselves physical and scientific futures and provide, at the same time, a very domestic environment for you to live in. So they would be very attractive, say, for people to come and live a farming lifestyle. So we developed this further and we began to establish corrals and platforms. Again, this is a very sort of spirited sketch. I think this one's from Laura's sketchbook here. And a 1 to 500 planimetric on the right showing the scales and territories and arrangement of the farm. And you can see the greenhouses here, these bits here, for the high value crops on these raised platforms. And zooming in a bit on this plan, you can see that the model farm sits on a raised platform which extends over its surrounding landscape, protecting the sort of elevated growing spaces. There's a buffer between the landscapes and the water, and there's lots of transitional sort of riparian forests we planted as well. I haven't shown them in this drawing though. There's lots of ways to get to the raised surface and lots of ways to anchor the elements. And there's a series of what we called utilitaries, which are these things here, which were designed to provide services out in the field, but they were raised up out of where the flood would be. For example, we got the idea from these bird boxes they're made from dried gourds, which are in the Museum of Appalachia here, and they provide nesting sites for purple martins. There's lots of other nesting boxes and things that were knocking around the place. Everything was raised up though. So it's all about generating a mutual beneficial relationship between farmers and wildlife. You know, the martins will help control the insect population and serve as a natural deterrent to things like birds of prey. So corrals and enclosures placed in here for shelter and security on the raised platform. The photo shows a very traditional method for fencing in that area. It needs to be cheap and quick, I suppose, and you can't really get much into the rocky ground, so it's a way of making a fence without fence posts. And then a closer look at the greenhouses, which show the high-value Luxois crops, such as the mountain mint. These will be in all the lit areas, you see. Lots of semi-autonomous farming. So the hoppers and silos. The hoppers and silos are quite interesting as well. You'll see on the model a bit later on, this is the underside of the model, that there are hoppers and silos that go through the datum which the farm is based on. So they're both on the raised farm, and they actually connect down to the ground as well. So they are the connections between the two worlds. There's lots of openings and apertures in there to allow trees and things to travel between the two layers. And there's a kind of gantry system that goes round. You'll see that a bit later as well. And again, this is actually a sort of hark back to the retreating village project I was talking about earlier, where the buildings are mainly made up of a hulk and a shell. So there's an external element, which is the wooden element, and there's the body of the building inside. And the two sort of don't quite match up in this instance. More autonomous agricultural machinery. This is more about the helping hand stuff. So this is about we worked with a few people trying to work out ways that you could have a system that would offer you a helping hand rather than take over completely. Could you do half a job? Could you do a third of a job? Could you do no job at all? Are the things that only a farmer could do and the robot couldn't? So we went through kind of lists of things like that, which I won't go into here, but there's that was quite an interesting part of that. So the final drawings for the project that try and capture all of this research, the spatial proposition, the culture, the history, and all that kind of stuff. They're a pair of 1 to 100 planometrics. Again, a very nice sketch by Laura there. And a very unusual projection we decided to put it in. And I guess we sort of lifted the idea of that projection really from Peter Wilson's Western Objects, Eastern Fields, which we grew up looking at that. I don't know if anyone knows that, but we grew up looking at that work, and the planometric seems to exist in there quite a lot, and it's just a way that we kind of visualize space. It's a really interesting, we think it's an interesting projection to look at work. And this is the other drawing that goes along with it. So you can see below there some of the stuff that's hanging below or on the ground level. So it's another restless, but sort of quite sparing drawing, actually, for us. There isn't too much information on them, I don't think. So as I was discussing before, there are lots of ways we try and imagine new architectures that operate in restless relationships. So our drawings are conceived like that, and our models are conceived like that. And I spoke about this one earlier. This is from Annie Get You Gun. This is 3 rotating rings at different speeds. And the one on the right is a particular favourite. It's a terrain board from an analog flight simulator. So you have a camera floating around on that surface, and that had a direct feed back to a screen that a pilot would sit in. They only had these for a very short amount of time before they had very crude CAD versions instead. But I really like the idea of the game board landscape that you can view at in a very different way. It reminds me of the Chris Burden project I really like, which is the one which it's about war and you view it through binoculars through the museum. I completely forget the name of the project now, but anyway, it's worth looking up. Another example of a kind of restless model is this one I've talked about before as well. And it's a very dark part of the Kiel de Forest, and it was a project that would appear and disappear at different times of the day, and you'd see it as a building in the dark and the building in the daytime. And what we tried to make happen, we tried to make the context change for that model, even though it was all based in the same sort of tub. So the context was either the stars or the context was the forest. And this is one from 100 years ago now, it seems. I don't know. This is the Treating Village, and it's a little model you can play with as well. So in terms of the models for Super Mega, they build on the drawings and the mapping work, and they work both empirically and conceptually. And again, lots more sketches, but they were looking at conveying the spirit of the dynamics inherent in the scheme, creating models that sort of discuss the schematic and systematic relationship between the river and the landscape in some way. And we started prototyping these in whatever was knocking around in the office. This is how, I explained before about photocopying onto bits of card and then building up from there. So the drawing, it's actually a two-dimensional drawing that then becomes a three-dimensional model, quite literally in front of your eyes. And this is the part of the final model. So the model demonstrates the community of the farm buildings inspired by the cantilever barns. The red areas are the areas where the Luxoir happens, the greenhouses, say, which have the special lighting in. And the platform is obviously to mitigate the flood risk. So we really, I think it's quite clear perhaps that we really like making and doing of all sorts. So there is no, each model we make fantastically complex for ourselves by not having a standard way of doing anything at all. So, these models are all the soldering and wire bending there I did by hand. The 3D printing I did, you can see the little nubs there are 3D printed, a bit of carpentry, a bit of polishing, a bit of soldering, and it all comes together. You kind of think of something and you imagine how you want it to be. But I think, secretly, I also think how fun it would be to make it in a certain way as well, and something that would give you delight and entertainment and actually performing the act of making the model as well. So I don't know. I think they're curious, and things that are curious make people interested. So that shows what's above and what's below, I think. And then an interesting aspect to the model, and actually an interesting aspect to our work recently, is that we make it all fit in standard size crates. So that may sound funny unless you've ever tried to pack anything and send anything anywhere. Then it isn't funny. It's actually deadly serious. You need to have standard size crates. So this model, if you look at the two sides of it, it folds up. It collapses into itself, so it fits in the size of crate that we have, which is about the size of this lectern here, and it's about that high. So the whole thing folds into a cube that size, and it was designed in a way that somebody at the other end could just kind of untie the string at the top, and it flops down and it opens up like that, which is all very exciting stuff. I've spoken to Jeff about packing things in crates, and he was excited at least. So we built another model as well because we felt that the 1 to 100 model shows buildings at 1 to 100, and we struggled to imagine how we would then tell the story of the entire valley just based on that. So we came up with this fluctuating light model that would talk about different coloured wavelengths of light emanating out the greenhouses, and you can see this is a description of the farms in the valley, and then the sort of rather curious drawings around it are descriptions of the valley as it appears around the building. So we kind of made that as a model. This isn't the best photo of it, I have to say, but what you can see there, the drum you can see there is a 7-day motor from a hygrograph in a museum. So it'll rotate once every 7 days. So you wind it up and it'll just go around. It ticks, it makes a nice ticking sound, which isn't very good for getting it through customs. But it rotates, I think it's 1 millimetre an hour. So put this up in the gallery where we showed the work, and there's a little wire belt that goes around it, and it rotates all of the prisms on the model. So what starts out as a model that looks one way, well then if you come back in another day, it'll have a different fluctuation of light across its body. Do I actually have the... Oh yeah. So this is me speeding it up manually by doing it by hand. We don't have time to wait for 18 hours for it to change colour. So it's something a bit like that, yeah? We had an idea for another model as well that never happened, but I always show this slide because I really want to make it. It's about the flood and the way the flood impacts on the valley at about 1 to 1,000, and how that may change the course of the planting or whatever that goes on. But anyway, that's probably for another day. This is just like putting it into this lecture, just so I remember to do it at some point. And then, you know, we're keen to experiment at this point with new methods and modes of drawings. This is something we want to do for this project at some point, but we've never really got round to it, to be honest. And it's using a kind of one of these axi-draw things to draw some of the more complex stuff for us. We've never really done that before, but there's lots of repetitious stuff in SRML, and it'd be quite nice if we had a hybridized drawing that was half drawn by us and half drawn by this. So I don't know whether we'll ever do that, but again, I put it into this lecture to remind myself to do it at some time. But it's quite nice the effects you can get from it. Yeah, there you are. So we're also part of this rather exciting drawing group, along with Perry and lots of other people, which we formed many years ago now, where we kind of discuss drawings and discuss what we're working on. It's very casual. And I was saying to everyone earlier that it's very handy when you leave here and you're interested in the subject of architecture to try and find yourself a peer group to operate within, because it's really good to be able to discuss projects and work not in isolation. You know, it's quite good to form friendships and things like that to continue your kind of interest. It's much easier doing it with other people than doing it by yourself. But one of the things we did with this drawing group was that we had an exhibition in the A83 gallery in New York, and they very kindly printed risographs and screen prints of the drawings, of our most recent drawings. And in our case, it was a risograph of one of the planimetrics there on the right. Except it was blue, not that. I don't know. Anyway, those are the ones. They're for sale on the website if you fancy that, but don't know. We're not keeping a list. So our contribution was the risograph to that exhibition, but then they were very interested in doing a triptych. So if you look at the drawing top right in my sketchbook, the tiny one, there was an idea that we could start to describe in a drawing rather than the model. We'd go back to doing a drawing of the flooding of light in the valley, and we thought a triptych was probably the best way to do it. So it ended up being a bit like this. This is where we started. This is a triptych in risograph form that then eventually became the screen print. The contribution was kind of was picked up by Stan Allen, who wrote a really, really nice thing about us, which we were very surprised. We had a very sort of unhinged conversation with him for an hour. And then it was incredible how he just kind of got everything that we were doing and kind of put it in some sort of context. I guess you call that professionalism, don't you? But anyway. So what did he write? I'll read it out, actually. Smout Allen simultaneously accept and complicate the conventions of architectural representation. They embrace the double condition of architectural drawing as at once a working tool of design, a story told about a future to come, and at the same time an autonomous work, intelligible on its own terms and in dialogue with other drawings, other histories. And we thought that was great because it kind of describes drawings as kind of looking forward but also looking backwards as well at the same time. So these are some of the details of the triptych. And one of the things we really loved about the triptych was that obviously they screen printed quite blank colours on there, like the white, the pink and the black, but then they did what was called a split fountain over the top. with a translucent yellow to pink ink. So they started at one end of the triptych in yellow, and at the other end it got to pink, but they were translucent and mixed in the middle. And it reminded me very much of if you ever listened to a lecture by Mike Webb, I don't know if you know Mike Webb, I'm sure Perry's talked about him. He talks about painting with oils, and it's fascinating, actually. And I don't know if anyone's ever painted with oils here. He talks about it as if you're painting with very, very, very thin layers of coloured glass. So you're putting layers of coloured glass onto a sheet of canvas or something like that, and it's really, and you can see it. Once he says it, you can kind of see it in all his work. It's quite interesting. But that's what the split fountain was like over the top of this. The photo doesn't really do it justice. So anyway, so the second project is going to talk about, which is not as kind of, doesn't have the depth of the other one, I don't think, because I haven't got the work here, is Rescue Lines. This is a project for Hashim Sarkis's Venice Biennale, which was started in 2020, I think, but it got done over by COVID. And so the proposal for us, which we worked on with Jeff Mano, again, another collaborator, proposed a world in which forests of the United Kingdom, both ancient and modern, can be expanded, restored, and connected once again. Our project took the form of a series of south to north ecological bridges, linear superscapes, along which displaced or endangered species can safely travel and threatened human economies can thrive. So it's conceived as a series of architectural tales, illustrated by these pieces you saw in an exhibition. There was a 1 to 10,000 map, which is the painted perspex bit there, which is like the size of 3 or 4 double beds, I think is probably the way to describe it. 3 wooden models at 1 to 200 on top, and then a series of drawings and things which I'll show you in a second. The narrative was used to make the environmental changes and communities and future-facing concepts and things like that. And there were 3 short stories that Jeff wrote for the piece of work as well. Obviously started with a sketch and a drawing, and I think some of you may have seen this one in my sketchbook. It's a funny, rather crude pencil thing, but there was some sort of magic in it, I think, and we quite liked it. So it was about connecting things from south to north. One of the we were interested in linear forests, but we were also interested in the hedgerow as a labyrinthine ecosystem of laid and woven plant species, and it was used to mark the edges of fields and property lines. I know you don't really have hedges much here, but they were very much an inspiration for us, as Laura and I both grew up in areas where there were lots and lots of hedges, and they're sort of like that in section. And I think there's like 500,000 miles of hedgerows in the UK, and they hold so much life in them, and they are like highways for flora and fauna to travel along the side of roads. They're really interesting things. The bottom left there, that's in a place called Powys Castle, Powys, in Wales, and it's called the cloud hedge, and it's the most ridiculous hedge you've ever seen. It is like a cloud. It's huge, absolutely huge. I've been there a few times when they've been cutting it, and they just go with the flow. It's like they're just really stoned, just going around cutting this thing. It's weird. It's got no structure to it at all. Anyway, and then there's lots of other sort of hedges and things that you can kind of imagine, or unstructured trees they might be in this case. So within the forest, we set up 3 new types of settlements. The first are proving grounds, which are inspired, following on from our interest in proving grounds, and there were ideas that there would be large-scale measuring tools there, calibration lines, scientific devices and gauges, and here's a few examples of things like that. These are whole tree heating chambers, and they heat the ground, they heat the air, and they just for doing tests on trees, and you just encapsulate the entire tree. Experimental ecology reserves, things like that. This is in Virginia, and these are automated weather observation stations and things like that located in these sort of funny wetland bogs and other funny bits and bobs. These are very sort of architectural school, aren't they? These things on the right. We never got to the bottom of what they are, I don't think, properly, but anyway. So the proving ground narrative would be where sort of teams and artists and photographers who work to document the changing landscape from within kind of live. And they track which creatures best thrive in these sort of augmented woods, and and ensuring that all the soils remain healthy and things like that. So we kind of have drawings of what these proving grounds may be like, with all the equipment and machinery and the surrounding landscape. This is in an exhibition at the moment in A83, this drawing, if anyone's going to New York. And then this is the kind of sketch that it kind of came from. And the idea was that not only is it a site for scientific investigation, it's also a place where, you know, picnickers could go and things like that, and you could enjoy, as a member of the public, the whole tree warming experiment. And again, lots of prototype card models, and that is the final model that sat on the Perspex table. So the second area of interest was the hedge house, and these are houses that were constructed around hedges and circular plots, and they supported the local economies of agriculture and research and timber production. And what we were trying to design with these houses, which we'll see in the next image, I think, is that they were designed as sort of valves rather than barriers in the hedges. So they were all about allowing flora and fauna to pass through them. They had lots and lots of apertures in them. They're pierced with voids and tunnels. And a feature of hedges you see in the UK is that animals tend to burrow underneath them, like rabbits live in them and things like that. So they were very porous buildings we were designing. And then that is some of the models for that. And these are quite nice drawings. The drawings sort of tessellated together a little bit, but not next to each other. They were all a bit like this, and then there's another one down there, and then like that. Didn't really think of it carefully enough, but anyway. So, and then another space is we call the landscape zoo. So to make the forests move up the country relatively quickly, you need areas to you need to grow a forest starter pack, you might call it, in these special places, and then you deploy them up through the country. So they're places where there's intense growth and future forests are developed and sown. But again, you know, we kind of we put buildings and livable spaces around the places where these special soils and rootstocks would start, while they wait for their eventual transportation up the forest. And there's sort of meadows and heaths and thickets and peat bogs all dotted around the project like sort of pixels. There's sort of there's netted canopies that sort of protect some of the trees that are drawn here as well. And Jeff wrote a lot of narrative about this. There were lots of story cards on there. I won't read them now, but he kind of imagined it like a sort of like a glass-bottomed boat, but a forest version, so you could kind of live in these buildings and understand what was underneath your feet. Risotrons, that's what he called them. And this is Laura drawing this. That's Laura, yeah. So there you are, live drawing. How's about that? On the right, you can see us laying out some of the panels of the 6 panels. We imagined the surface again was going to be like the sort of flight simulator. When you looked on the top half of the panels, we had direct-to-media printing. We had of all the detail of where the houses, where the roads, where the infrastructure were, where the bits of architecture were, and the territories. On the underside, we had a hand-painted version of where the forest would go. So these two worlds kind of collided at that point, and you can see the brushstrokes of the forests underneath. This is it leaned up against our fireplace in our front room, which is not a great photo, but it is. You can see the extent of this. So you can see the direct-to-media print on the front, and you can see the green behind. The painting behind was very much a one-shot deal as well. Did it with a very wide brush, did it in one stroke, which was quite terrifying. But it was a really nice effect because you saw it sort of bristled out towards the edges. All those edges were frayed. It was something that you couldn't really control. And these are images of the front of those panels. I think they look amazing when you see them in real life because there's a parallax to them if you move slightly to the left and right because of the depth of the printing. And then that's it in real life. Just one more thing, and then I'm done. This is, as part of this, we were commissioned by Olafa Ellison to submit a piece of work into what he called the Future Assembly at the Venice Biennale. He asked for sort of contributions for a future UN for underrepresented entities, which is actually a really nice idea, and we entered the hedgerow into that. So we built this rather strange multi-scaled model to put into that exhibition, and as you can see, there's a scale which describes some sort of maintenance to the hedgerow. If you look inside the trees, there's a different scale in there again, and it discusses these things seemingly loose. Hedgerows being seemingly loose, but actually being quite well maintained and looked after. And that was quite a nice ending to the model making. I have to confess, I did use a load of bits that were left over from the other model to make this model, because we'd run out of money and time at that point. It's good to have at least one of those things, isn't it? And so that's it, really. I mean, if you like what you've seen, there's more on our website for you to see. There's this project, which is quite interesting, the Liquid Kingdom one, and then our latest one we did for the most recent Biennale, which is this thing on the right. So do go and have a look at that, and tell me what you think. So thank you very much.